Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and welcome to the presentation series. Here's what I produced this week. And you can see that it collapsed the entire window into a free-floating icon. This free-floating icon can be placed anywhere on the screen that you'd like by clicking and dragging on this little gripper visual aid I put here. Little grippers like this are often found on mobile applications, so as I see it, people already know that this is a visual cue that means that you can go ahead and click and drag on it in some way or another. You open the window back to full size. So as you can see, the main thing that we're going to be focusing on is how to get two objects to move in unison with one another. Now, on YouTube, there's a number of tutorials on the hook tool, but by and large, the only one that I find really informative is from Debraj Sarkar, and even his tutorials don't really explain variously different attributes of using the hook tool. Furthermore, there's not many people talking about the hook tool in general and how it behaves. And as a result, I really struggled with this particular animation. And I'd like to offer a special thank you to SnapEye for his willingness to make a quick comment on how to use hooks. It just goes to show you that big things come in small packages. And so if you'd like to take a look at SnapEye's channel, feel free to look in the video description below. Once again, SnapEye is, in my opinion, the foremost authority on how to work with cutout animations in Opentoonz. So let's go ahead and jump into this, shall we? So the first thing on the screen is me constructing the specific type of icon I need for this video. In the previous video, I constructed a few icons, but those icons were for snapped, collapsed windows. I need to create a gripper bar and a red X to the top of an unsnapped, collapsed window. So I started my work in Opentoonz by opening up the scene that I worked on in the previous video in this series. And then I went File, Save Scene As, and I typed in Presentation 003. I did this because I created a good number of assets in the Presentation 002 scene. I created an artificial replica of the Opentoonz interface. I scaled and positioned all of the windows just right. I really didn't want to have to do that again for two reasons. First, it would still look slightly different, and second, because it's time consuming. So by doing the Save Scene As function, I've managed to keep consistency between scenes, and I've also exercised an optimization of my time. Now, I went and hunted down some assets. The first thing that I needed to do was get a cursor. I really didn't want to make my own cursor for this presentation, so I did a quick Google search for cursor PNG and downloaded one really quickly. Once I downloaded it, I went ahead and threw it into Opentoonz and clicked the import button. Then I scaled the cursor down to approximately the size of a normal cursor and named the level on the timeline Cursor. Go figure. Then I needed the audio for this scene so that I could understand the timing that needed to be in place throughout the course of this animation. I then clicked and dragged the MP3 into Opentoonz, and then what I did is I exposed the cursor level for the full extent of the animation, and then set the center for the cursor with the Animate tool. Then I moved the cursor just a bit off the screen. No matter what, you will always want to have your cursor at the top of the stacking order on the timeline. At this point, I needed the icon that I made at the beginning of this video. So I grabbed the icon and dragged it into Opentoonz and clicked Import. I then named that level on the timeline xsheet, which means Free Floating xsheet. So for some reason, PNGs can be scaled down, but they can't be scaled up in size, especially when you're using the selection tool. So I had to slightly scale up the free floating icon with an animation by using the Animate tool. Now, please keep in mind that you need to be careful when you scale things up or down with the Animate tool, because you're not actually authentically scaling anything. The visual scaling that happens is just an animation. This can cause problems for you if you can't distinguish the difference. So yeah, I scaled up the size of the free-floating icon. I wanted it to be about the same size as any other tool on the tools panel. Then I placed it where I wanted the collapsed window to appear at the moment of being collapsed. Then I exposed the free-floating icon for the full extent of the animation. Then I listened carefully for any type of audio cues for each action that needed to take place for the duration of the animation. I moved the position of the cursor as if it's clicking the white arrow above the xsheet. Now, the free-floating icon didn't need to be exposed until after it was collapsed, so I deleted all the frames prior to the new keyframe on the cursor level, and then deleted a few more. Because typically, a cursor will sit over an icon for a micro stutter of a moment and then click. Once the free-floating xsheet appears on the screen, I wanted the normal xsheet to be sucked into the collapsed window. This way, there's some sort of visual to indicate that these two objects are in some way related. So I moved the xsheet so that its center was right on the free-floating icon, and then scaled it down to be really tiny. And then I got rid of all the rest of the frames on the xsheet level from that point on. It's important to note that if you want a hold on an object, you need to create two identical keyframes. You can do that just by clicking the key icon at the bottom of the viewer. If objects keep moving about and they're not sitting still in your animation, it's because you're not creating two identical keyframes. Initially, when I animated the xsheet getting sucked into the collapsed icon, the xsheet didn't hold until the cursor went over the arrow and clicked. Instead, it immediately started to collapse before the mouse even came close to clicking on the white arrow. I went through some convoluted workflow to figure out how to fix the problem, but just know that that's all you really need to do from the very beginning. Also, you can move keyframes on the xsheet. Just click directly on the key icon, not the frame, but the actual icon of the key on the frame. Pause for a moment, and then click and drag the keyframe icon to move the keyframe to a different frame on the timeline. That was a mouthful. Now, I wanted the audience to be able to actually see the free-floating icon, and yet the cursor level and its graphic was just covering it up, so I moved the cursor to the right of the free-floating icon, and I wanted it to hold this position. So I went a few frames out on the timeline and clicked on the key on the viewer. Then I needed to click and drag the free-floating icon. So I went a few frames further in, moved the cursor over the gripper, then I found the timing that I needed on the timeline and moved the cursor to a different location. The cursor's larger movement is supposed to be the clicking and dragging on the free-floating icon. So this is the moment I actually focused on getting these two objects to move in unison. So now it's time to be creating some hooks. Now, I'm about to say something about the hook tool that you won't really hear from anyone else's tutorials on Opentoonz, as of right now, at least. And maybe the Opentoonz manual or Harley Quinn guide mentioned this, but I kind of doubt it. But what you need to understand about the hook tool is that once you use it and parent an object to that hook, you can't make it work incrementally here and there throughout the animation. Once the hook is applied to something, it's applied for the entire animation, start to finish. I edited out a lot of video footage for this video where I was starting to understand hooks and how they work. And I did probably about 8 different failed techniques. Trust me when I say that you want to do it this way. What we need is a duplicate level of our free-floating icon. So I find the image of the free-floating icon, click and drag it into the scene, and click Import. And then I click Keep Existing File. I then find the new level and place it where it needed to be on the stacking order, and renamed the level on the timeline
Hooked.
Now remember, I slightly scaled up the original free-floating icon level. So I went into the function editor and I got the scaling information from the original free-floating icon, and then I pasted it into the scaling information on the hooked level. I then moved the center on the hooked level with the Animate tool. With the hooked level, I moved the frame and keyframe over to the beginning of the animation. Then I exposed the hooked frame for the full extent of the animation. I then selected the cursor level and selected the hook tool. Now, sometimes when using hooks, you need to click and drag the position of the hook frame by frame. And sometimes the hook tool just does a really good job in auto-tracking an object. In this case, the hook tool did a good job auto-tracking the tip of the cursor. But just to be safe, I looked over the entire animation, frame by frame, just to make sure that the hook didn't just venture off and do its own thing. Also, notice that there's a number associated to the hook, and in this case, it's the number 1. This is important to remember. Now it's time to go into the Animation tab and go to the stage schematic. I grabbed my cursor node and my hooked level and set them right next to one another. To the bottom right of the schematic is that button that will toggle between the effect schematic and the stage schematic. Just make sure that you're on the stage schematic. And also, just look to the left of that button. There's this button that when you hover your mouse over it, there's a tooltip that will appear that reads Switch Output Port Display Mode. By clicking on this button, you get more functionality to the stage schematic. It's not just a blue output and a red input to each node. So if you hover your mouse over the input node, which will in all probability have the letter B on it, you'll see a tiny gray arrow up and arrow down icon appear. Click on that and drag up until the input turns into the number 1, because our hook was assigned the number 1. That's why it was important to remember that the number 1 was assigned to the hook. We're telling the stage schematic that we don't just want to parent these two guys together. We want the hooked level parented to the hook. So I grab the output to the hooked node and plug it into the 1 on the cursor node. So I go back into the basic tab and play the animation. You can see that the hooked level is completely glued to the cursor at all times. This is what we want, but a few things need to be adjusted. For one, the hooked level is exposed for the full duration of the animation. For another, the tip of the cursor isn't on the gray gripper at the top. So I use the Animate tool and reposition the hooked level so that the cursor is pinpointed on the gripper. Then I delete frames on the timeline where I don't want the hooked level to be visible.
The goal is to stagger the activity of the free-floating xsheet level and the hooked level on the timeline. When the hooked level is exposed on the xsheet, the free-floating icon level shouldn't be exposed, and the same vice versa.
So at the moment when the cursor is supposed to click and drag the free-floating icon, I thought that I could get the northeast, southwest information on the stage schematic and place it onto the hooked level for that frame. But that didn't work because it's anchored to the hook, so its center is kind of wonky because of the hook. I needed the hooked level and the free-floating icon to be in the exact same position, though. So I decided that there's no problem with eyeballing it. If it's just a few pixels off, it's fine. It's animation. Things are supposed to move in animation anyways. That's what animation is. It's motion. Once I saw that it looked like a successful click and drag with the hooked level, I got rid of the free-floating icon for the duration of the clicked drag action. And just for practice, I repeated this activity again. I've got to say that since the Opentoonz 1.1.3 release, working with the Animate tool as a type of workflow has become far more stable. One of the reasons why my first attempt at making the presentation series didn't work was because Opentoonz was crashing every step of the way. Whereas with 1.2.0 and its most recent nightly build, I didn't experience any crashes except for when importing something that dealt with FFmpeg integration. But to prevent those sorts of crashes, all you need to do is drag your MP4 or MP3 file into Opentoonz and then leave it alone until it's done processing. Or when opening a scene with an MP4 or MP3, leave Opentoonz alone. Let it load for 2 or 3 minutes. That's probably an over-exaggeration. And then just let it load. Don't just keep clicking on the interface and Opentoonz will load it just fine. You might experience some error message about FFmpeg timing out, but even when that shows up, I haven't really experienced any real major problems. All these timed out messages don't seem to mean anything to me when it appears to have loaded everything just fine. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like it, please like, share, and subscribe. Anyways, there's a lot of work that goes into these videos. And if you'd like to take a look at any of my other videos, feel free to click on any of them that are appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.